Oh, I'm so excited to get back in the gym. It's been a while. This is weird. Something doesn't feel right. I've done this so many times. I'm only curling fives right now. I used to be able to do way more than this. Something's not right. Man, I wish yesterday went better, but gotta stay consistent. I'm gonna get back in there and see how it goes. Oh man, this feels so much better. I only went up 5 pounds, but I'm feeling strong already. Something feels different. It feels so much better this time. I really got the hang of this.
So what is the relationship between our muscles and brain? Well, the nervous system is the command center of the body, controlling and regulating all body systems, including our musculoskeletal system. The nervous system communicates with the rest of the body via neurons, which we will get into later. Our skeletal muscle is one of the three types of muscles in the human body, the others being cardiac and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle is the only muscle to be innervated by the somatic nervous system, which means that it contracts voluntarily. Skeletal muscle is vital for basic human function as it is responsible for posture, movement, heat generation, and joint stabilization. To explore how electrical signals travel throughout an axon, we must examine what happens on a chemical level. When the electrical signal travels through a neuron, this is known as an action potential. Action potentials travel in all directions and are non-decremental, meaning that the strength of the electrical signal is maintained as it propagates through the axon. Action potentials are defined as a rapid sequence of change in voltage across a membrane. So looking at the big picture, how do neurons and their action potentials drive skeletal muscle contraction? Well, the excitation-contraction coupling mechanism is the physiological response of converting this electrical signal into a mechanical contraction. So to begin, impulses from the spinal cord stimulate neuron cells, initiating an action potential down the axon. During this, a wave of positive charge propagates down the membrane until it reaches the synaptic terminal. Once the depolarizing wave reaches the synaptic terminal, it stimulates calcium influx into the synaptic terminal via voltage-gated calcium channels. This causes synaptic vesicles, which contain neurotransmitters, to translocate and fuse with the axon terminal membrane, in which the neurotransmitters will then be released into the synaptic cleft, the region between the muscle cell and neuron. The neurotransmitter then binds to ligand-gated ion channels on the membrane of the muscle cell, which is known as the sarcolemma. This binding causes resting membrane potential to rise until it reaches its threshold potential. Once threshold potential is attained, an action potential occurs, encompassing further depolarization as sodium ions enter the cell via voltage-gated sodium channels down the sarcolemma. The action potential propagates down along the sarcolemma and down the T-tubules, which are invaginations in the sarcolemma. The action potential stimulates dihydropyridine receptors, which function as voltage sensors embedded along the T-tubules, to pluck off ryanodine receptors, which are bound to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Ryanodine receptors essentially function as the gates for the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is the calcium storage unit of muscle cells. Once these ryanodine receptors are unbound to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, calcium is released into the cytosol, in which it will bind to muscle cells to stimulate contraction. To end contraction, however, sarcoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase pumps along the sarcoplasmic reticulum pump calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum to await further depolarizing stimuli. So we now understand the underlying cellular mechanisms of muscle contraction. But you're still probably wondering, what about the bigger picture? How exactly does the nervous system drive muscle contraction on a larger scale? Well, somatic motor neurons innervate skeletal muscle and function as electrical highways that send impulses from the spinal cord and to the muscle that drive voluntary muscle contraction. Motor neurons are grouped by motor units, which is defined as a motor neuron and all the muscle fibers it innervates. But it's more complicated than that. The human body contains different types of muscle fibers and thus different types of motor units. The human body contains three types of muscle fibers: type 1, type 2A, and type 2X. Type 1 fibers have the greatest oxidative capacity and are highly resistant to fatigue, but are the slowest twitch fibers, whereas type 2X fibers are the fastest twitch, but are highly prone to fatigue. Type 2A contains intermediate qualities between these two fibers, meaning that, for example, it's not the fastest twitch, nor is it the slowest twitch. But as mentioned before, the human body has different motor units that innervate these different types of muscle fibers. We have type S motor units that primarily innervate slow twitch type 1 muscle fibers, type FR motor units that innervate type 2A muscle fibers, and type FF motor units that innervate type 2X fibers. In addition, the innervation ratio describes the number of muscle fibers per motor neuron. So for example, in this photo, the ratio would be 1:4. So now you may be wondering, why do we have different motor units? Well, this is what actually accounts for differences in strength and accuracy of certain skeletal muscles. The size principle describes the pattern of motor unit recruitment during exercise, such that the smallest motor units and slowest muscle fibers are recruited first. So for example, if I were to do something that requires fine motor control, I would recruit type S motor units and activate my slowest twitch muscle fibers with a low innervation ratio. But if I needed to carry a 10-pound box of pencils, I would begin to recruit my fastest twitch motor units and muscle fibers with a larger innervation ratio to maximize force production.
So when looking at the neural adaptations from exercise, it is clear to see via this graph that the neural adaptations drive these initial increase in strength, and that there's a clear correlation between the progress of the neural adaptation to that of the progress of strength, as seen in the graph. The improvements that are made as a result of this are, first of all, the total motor units that are activated, which we'll talk about right now. So when looking at the total number of activated motor units, we look at the Golgi tendon organ, which is located in the tendon and is a muscle proprioreceptor, which means that it's a sensory receptor which receives stimuli from the body and one that responds to position and movement, essentially acting as a sense of self-movement, force, and body position. And so this Golgi tendon organ detects tension in the muscle and inhibits the muscle when the tension becomes excessive. And an adaptation that comes as a result of this is that the alterations in the Golgi tendon organ signaling allows the increased ability to overcome the Golgi tendon organ inhibition. So, continuing on, another improvement that is made as a result of this neural adaptation is the firing rates of the neurons. So when looking at the neurons, it's clear to see that through these graphs that are included below, that the firing rates of the neurons are increased, which therefore leads to more action potential and summation, and ultimately a greater force production. And furthermore, more muscle fibers are able to reach a state of tetanus, which is sustained muscle contraction invoked when the motor nerve that innervates a skeletal muscle emits action potential at a very high rate. And now, lastly, looking at our third improvement is the motor unit synchronization. So when looking at this synchronization, this is obviously a broad definition, but it's looking at the coordinated recruitment of the numerous motor units. And then there's this idea of rate coding, which is the number of motor units that are recruited and takes into account the rate of action potential discharge. So essentially, rate coding is talking about specifically this force that is exerted by a muscle during a voluntary contraction, and it depends specifically on these two things, which is the number of motor units recruited and the action potential discharge rate. And so when we're looking at this adaptation from exercise, we can see that an increase in synchronization leads to maximizing force output, and that there's an optimal communication between the musculoskeletal and nervous system. So essentially, there's very much a synchronization. That's going back to the first point, and we see this through the rate coding that exists.